A whole American generation remembers one sentence from a school computer screen. "You have died of dysentery." The screen never said that. The man who designed that version of the game files the line under memes, alongside the little ox pulling a wagon, and the software itself put the words a different way. Millions of adults will still tell you they read those exact words on a beige machine in a school library, and they are certain about it. That is a strange thing for a piece of educational software to have done to people. If you went to an American elementary school in the 1980s or the 1990s, there is a fair chance your first real hour on a computer was spent trying to keep 5 imaginary people alive inside a wagon, and that the wagon left a mark nothing else from that room did. Almost everything around it is gone. The 3 student teachers who wrote the first version printed the code onto paper, and then the program was wiped off the school computer at the end of the term. The agency in Minnesota that turned their idea into a product shut its doors in 1999. The toy company that ended up owning it lost so much money on the deal that business magazines still list the purchase among the worst ever made. After that, the rights moved 4 more times, and almost nobody followed them. The game did not go with any of it. One archive page holds the DOS version from 1990, and that page has been opened nearly 14 million times. It runs inside a browser tab. There is no install, no disk, and no permission required from anyone. What follows is how a 2-week class assignment turned into a business that changed hands for hundreds of millions of dollars, and then kept changing hands long after the people who built it were gone. The second half of that has never been put in one place, because the trail runs through corporate filings instead of through anybody who was actually in the room. The first half runs through a janitor closet. In the autumn of 1971, 2 men named Bill Heineman and Paul Dillenberger came back to their apartment in Crystal, Minnesota, and found their roommate on the living room floor. Don Rowich was drawing a map of the western half of the country onto long sheets of butcher paper. All 3 were seniors at Carleton College, and all 3 were student teachers. Rowich had been handed an 8th grade history unit on Western expansion, and nothing he tried had worked. So he was building a board game instead. Players would walk the 2,000 miles from Independence, Missouri, to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, meeting the same disasters the real families met. He planned to move pieces with dice. His roommates had taken a few programming courses, and Heineman asked the question that redirected everything. What if we put this thing on a computer? Then survival would not be a dice roll. It could depend on the weight of the load and on what had been paid for oxen. Rowich said yes. The unit had to be ready in under 2 weeks. Heineman looked at Dillenberger and said they could do that. In 1971 there were almost no computers in schools. What the lucky schools had was a teletype, which was an electric typewriter wired through a phone line to a mainframe the size of a room. Bryant Junior High kept its teletype in a converted janitor closet, and that is where the 3 of them worked for 2 weeks. The whole thing came to about 800 lines of code. Rowich opened the game in front of his 8th graders on the 3rd of December, 1971. He rolled the teletype into the middle of the room, and the machine printed its questions onto a roll of paper. How much do you want to spend on clothing? A number gets typed in, and the machine answers with the next question. Hunting worked by typing the word bang. Type it fast and clean, and the eating would be good that night. Type it slowly, and the machine said the player was slow on his colt. There were no pictures at all. If the wagon and the green hills are what you remember, understand that the first version had neither of them. The screen was a roll of paper. Only one student could be at the keyboard at a time, and the teletype could only be booked for a single week, so the class had to organize itself. That is worth holding on to, because most people remember this as a game you played alone. They split into groups and voted on answers. Somebody handled the hunting, somebody followed the map, somebody counted the supplies. Then the queue started. Students lined up outside the door and stayed after school for another turn. The kids also found the holes. Spending a negative amount of money on clothing made the cash pile grow, and the 3 teachers kept editing the code while the games were running. Then the term ended. Their student teaching was over, and the 3 of them printed the source code onto paper. The program itself came off the computer. For the next 3 years, the only copy of the most popular thing in that building was a roll of paper in an apartment. In 1973, the state legislature created something called the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium. Its job was to put computers and computer training into schools across the state, jointly backed by the university, the state college system, and the education department. A year later, that consortium hired Don Rawich as an entry-level liaison for community colleges. It was the bottom rung, and it was not a design job. But the consortium was also building a library of software for Minnesota schools, and Rawich had a roll of paper. Over the Thanksgiving weekend of 1974, he dug it out and typed the whole thing back in by hand. He did not retype it as it was. He went to the diaries of people who had actually walked the trail and rebuilt the odds from them. He found out how often parties really ran out of water. He counted the ways people actually died. He also took note of how the native nations along the route had actually behaved toward the wagon parties. Those numbers went into the game. In 1975, the finished version went onto the consortium time-sharing network, open to any school in Minnesota. That network ran to 1,500 terminals across the state. Thousands of students a month were now playing. Apart from a crude electronic mail that let students pass notes between teletypes, this history homework was the most used software in Minnesota. By the late 70s, the personal machines were arriving, and the consortium had to pick one to support. It ran a formal evaluation and bidding process, and the Radio Shack machine lost. The consortium picked the Apple II, and that decision turned out to be one of the most important early sales in the history of Apple. In 1978, the consortium delivered 500 Apple machines into Minnesota public schools. Any school in the state could buy Apples through the consortium, which resold them at cost, and which meant no district had to run its own evaluation or purchasing process. Apple moved more than 5,000 machines through that arrangement by 1983. Starting with the Iowa Education Department in 1980, 5,000 school districts around the world bought site licenses for the consortium catalog. By 1982, it had put 250,000 copies of its software into schools. That is the part that changed what the organization was. The membership business worked so well that the state subsidies stopped, and in May of 1984, the legislature dissolved the consortium and rewrote it as a corporation that was expected to pay its own way. The state of Minnesota still owned it, and otherwise it was independent. By the 1985 school year, it was selling more than 300 products and turning about $7 million a year. A state agency had quietly become a software company, and if your school bought educational software in that decade, a share of it came out of Minnesota. The market, meanwhile, had moved again. Educational software was no longer amateurs writing for mainframes. It was companies selling boxes for home machines, and the consortium catalog looked old next to them. So in October of 1984, a designer named Philip Bouchard was told to build a new version of the trail from scratch. It took 10 months and 5 people. Bouchard led it. John Krenz was lead programmer, Cherilyn Kaplinger was lead artist, Shirley Kieran did the research, and Bob Granvin wrote code. The brief carried one line that had never appeared at the consortium before. This one was aimed at families buying software for the home first, and at schools second. That single instruction is why the version you remember looks like a product rather than a lesson. The old version ran 12 rounds of 2 weeks each. The new one broke the journey into 16 uneven segments, each ending at a real landmark, with different weather and different odds in every stretch. The doctor and the medicine from the old version were cut for being historically wrong, and a set of real diseases went in instead. The hunting sequence needed to run fast, so it was written in assembly, and a programmer named Roger Shimada was pulled in to finish it. The design called for 18 animals. The machine could carry 6. That March there was one more problem. When the classroom testing began, the artwork for dead animals was not ready, so the team turned the living animals over on their backs to indicate their deaths. Nobody replaced it. The animal on its back shipped, and it stayed in the game that tens of millions of children played. That is the sort of accident this game is made of, and it explains the line everybody remembers. If every member of the party died, the screen produced a gravestone carrying the name of the party leader, and the player was invited to type an epitaph onto it. That gravestone did not disappear. On the next attempt, when the wagon reached the same point on the trail, The same stone was standing there with the same words on it, so a class of children could bury each other and then walk past the graves for the rest of the year. If you ever walked up to a stone with a name on it that you did not recognize, it was left there by whoever had the machine before you. Then there is the illness list, and this is where the famous sentence actually comes from. In the original text game, when a traveler got sick, the illness was never named at all. Bouchard went back to what people on the trail had actually written down, and he took the names they used most often. Typhoid, cholera, measles, dysentery, exhaustion, fever. The screen did not address the player, though. It used a name the player had typed in at the start of the journey, in the third person, about somebody else in the wagon. So the most quoted line in the history of educational software is a sentence that the software never printed. A generation took a list of diseases and a tombstone, compressed them into one line, moved that line into the second person, and remembered the compression instead of the original. Bouchard has written about this himself, and his own word for the result is a meme. Later versions went further. Staff at the consortium were recruited to sing folk tunes from the 1840s into the soundtrack. Counted together across every edition since 1971, the trail games have sold more than 65 million copies. Which brings the story to the money, and the money is where it goes strange. In 1991, the state of Minnesota decided it did not have the capital to push the consortium into the home market and onto other machines. So the state sold the whole thing to a venture capital fund. The price was $5.25 million. Consider what the state was selling. 2 weeks of 3 student teachers in a converted closet with a teletype in it. A roll of paper carried out of a school building at the end of a term and kept in an apartment for 3 years. One Thanksgiving weekend of Don Rowich typing 800 lines back in by hand and then going to the diaries of the people who had actually walked west. To find out how often a party ran out of water and to count the ways they died. That was the asset. Rowich was not in the building when it sold. He had left the year before. The numbers he had pulled out of those diaries kept running in every copy in every school in the state, and they went across with the rest of the catalog. Bill Heinemann is the one who had asked, "What if we put this thing on a computer?" Paul Dillenberger spent those 2 weeks of evenings in the closet with him. What the three of them made in a term of student teaching is what the state of Minnesota sold in 1991. In February of 1995, the company threw a party at the Mall of America to mark what it had become. There was a live buffalo on the floor named Cody. Rowich, Heinemann, and Dillenberger were brought in and publicly credited, most of them for the first time, and each of them was handed a matching denim jacket with a logo stitched on it that read Trailheads. Rowich had been gone 5 years by then. He was brought back to stand in a shopping mall beside a buffalo and be thanked. That was the ceremony. Here is what happened next. Within months, the consortium was bought by a company called Softkey in a deal worth $370 million in stock. $5.25 million in 1991, $370 million in 1995. The 3 men who wrote it got jackets. Softkey was not buying a game, it was assembling a portfolio. In December of 1995, it took over the learning company, fired a large share of the staff, and adopted the name of the company it had just swallowed. From that point, the trail was published by a company that had bought its own name. If you owned a boxed copy in that decade, the logo on the front belonged to a business the actual buyer had already taken apart. What that owner did next is the part that former designers remember. In the words of Scott Osterweil, who had designed for a rival studio, Softkey basically gutted the research and development side and put all its money into marketing. Titles that did not earn at the level of the trail were cut. Dozens of jobs went out of the Minneapolis office, and in 1999, the consortium that had made the game shut down for good. That same year, the toy company Mattel bought the whole package. Signed in December of 1998 and announced at $3.8 billion. Mattel cut 3,000 jobs to pay for it. It did not work for a single quarter. In the year 2000, Mattel posted a net loss of $430 million. Whatever your family paid for a boxed copy in those months went to a company that had already resolved to get rid of it. Here is where every account of this game stops. The usual version ends with the toy company, the collapse, and a line about how sad it all was. But the trail did not stop in the year 2000. It changed hands 4 more times, and each of those transfers is on the public record. In March of 2000, the Mattel board formally resolved to get rid of the division. And from the 31st of that month, the entire software business was carried in the accounts as a discontinued operation. Then in October of 2000, almost every subsidiary that ran the learning company was sold to an affiliate of a firm called Gores Technology Group. The words Mattel used in its own annual filing are worth reading exactly as written. The subsidiaries were sold in exchange for future consideration, not for cash, for future consideration. The buyers named in the paperwork were a living trust in the name of Alec Gores himself, and a company formed for the transaction. Not a publisher buying a catalog, but a private trust taking delivery of it, with the price left to be worked out later. The buyer had a different experience. Gores announced that the business it had just taken over was already profitable. The same catalog was a multi-billion-dollar write-off on one side of the transaction and a profitable business on the other, and no cash moved between them. And the game was still there in the catalog while all of that happened. A history assignment from a junior high school in Minneapolis had become a line item that got moved between owners in exchange for future consideration. Nobody who played it knew any of this. Children were still burying each other on the trail in school computer labs, while the thing they were playing was being handed between holding companies. And the discs in the cabinet did not change at all when the owner did. If you were in one of those labs in the year 2000, the software in front of you had just been transferred without a payment, and the school that bought it had no reason to be told. The chain did not stop at Gores either. In 2001, the catalog went to a Dublin company called Riverdeep, founded in 1995 and run by an Irish former investment banker named Barry O'Callaghan. Riverdeep took the learning company and a good part of the rest of the educational software industry with it. Then, in 2006, Riverdeep merged with the American textbook publisher Houghton Mifflin, and the learning company became a brand inside a book publisher. The following year, that publisher bought Harcourt and renamed itself Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. So by 2007, a wagon game written on a teletype belonged to one of the largest school textbook publishers in the United States. In 15 years, the trail had traveled from a state agency to a venture fund, to a stock market listing, to a hostile buyer, to a toy company, to a buyer who paid no cash for it, and then to an Irish software house. And it finished that run back inside a classroom supplier, which is very close to where it began. That is where most people who bother to look this up stop, and it is now out of date. In May of 2021, HarperCollins completed a purchase of the entire consumer publishing arm of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt for about $350 million in cash. The trail went with it. Today, the franchise sits with HarperCollins Productions, alongside Carmen Sandiego. That is not a guess. HarperCollins is named as the rights holder in the press material for the current game, next to the trademark. And there is a current game. In April of 2021, a studio called Gameloft Brisbane released a complete remake of the 1985 version, and it became the most downloaded game on Apple Arcade that year. On the 14th of November, 2022, that remake moved on to Steam, Windows, and the Nintendo Switch for just under $30. It has since reached PlayStation and Xbox, and it has been pressed onto physical cartridges and discs. A game about a wagon, written in a closet on a machine that printed onto paper, is currently sold as a boxed console release with a plastic case and a barcode on the back. The remake also changed who the story belongs to. Its creative director worked with several native scholars on the writing, with the stated aim of stripping out the stereotypes and the historical errors that the older versions had carried for decades. The result puts the crossing in front of the people who were already living along the route, which is a first for a series that has been in print since 1971. In 2016, the trail was added to the World Video Game Hall of Fame, counted as one long work running from 1971 onward. It was the first educational game ever put in. Smithsonian Magazine wrote that year that the trail is still a cultural landmark for any school kid who came of age in the 1980s or after, and that there remains a constant pressure to revive the series so that nostalgic Generation Xers and Millennials can amble westward with a dysentery-riddled party once again. The pressure got answered in more than one direction. In late February of 2018, Target quietly put a handheld version on its shelves for about $25, made by Basic Fun and sold nowhere else. The body is beige. A plastic floppy disk sticks out of the front, and that disk is the power switch. There is a small screen, a speaker that produces 8-bit noise, buttons for enter and for yes and no, and a key shaped like a wagon that stops the journey so the player can rest, hunt, or trade. A reviewer at The Verge called it a miniature Apple II gadget and bought one at his local store. If you ever sat in front of the real thing, the resemblance is the entire product. None of that is the last surviving copy, though, and this is the part worth keeping. The Internet Archive holds 4 of them, free, running inside a browser through an emulator. There is the Apple release from 1985 and the DOS release that followed it 5 years later. There is the Macintosh port from the year after that, and the deluxe edition from the year after that one. The DOS release is the one that people found. Its page went up on the 26th of December, 2014, and it has collected almost 600 written reviews and 2,000 bookmarks since. The file is about 915 kilobytes, which is smaller than one photograph taken on your phone this morning. The program it launches is still named Oregon. That page has now been opened nearly 14 million times. Every institution in this story is gone or unrecognizable. The state agency closed, the publisher that bought it was swallowed by a firm that took its name, the toy company wrote off billions and handed the catalog over without a payment, and the rights ended up with a book publisher in New York. What that janitor closet started is now a file of about 900 kilobytes on a public archive. Any browser will open it in about 2 seconds. It is still asking how much you want to spend on clothing. There are a lot of machines like this one, shut down by their owners and still quietly running somewhere. Subscribe and the next one shows up.